This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hello and welcome back to the Week in Sustainability. I'm Melissa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life. And in this week's episode, I want to spend a little time talking about some of the state level legislative efforts underway for climate disclosure here in the US. So, a lot of this focuses on California. Like many times, they are leading the way in environmental and climate legislation. And you all might remember us talking about this back in October when Governor Gavin Newsom signed 3 comprehensive corporate climate disclosure laws into effect. And these laws all target large companies, large operators that do business in the state of California, as well as those pursuing net zero and carbon neutral claims. And this represents a continued pattern that we're seeing across global jurisdictions, frankly, requiring corporate transparency and accountability related to climate change. So let's spend a little time breaking down these laws. We've talked about these before, but I think what we really want to highlight here is how they're paving the way for other state level ambitions that we're seeing. We'll talk about things coming out of the state of Washington and New York, but let's focus and hone in on California because those are the laws that are in effect today. So we have SB 253, known as the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. And that's essentially mandating emissions disclosure. It mandates the disclosure of greenhouse gases, scopes 1, 2, and scope 3. And this applies to companies with annual revenues exceeding $1 billion that do business in the state of California. Like many of these emissions disclosure laws, there's a phased in timeline of reporting that begins in 2026 for scopes 1 and 2, and then follows a year later with scope 3 in 2027. This law does require third-party assurance with phased-in requirements starting in 2030. So there's a fair bit of time for companies to start measuring their emissions, getting their arms around their emissions inventory before they're held to those assurance requirements. This law does have penalties for noncompliance, but really important to note that Scope 3 misstatements incur no penalties until 2030. And that feels similar to what we have in the proposed SEC rule around safe harbor for Scope 3. And that's because Scope 3 emissions, which occur outside of the corporate operating boundary and through that more external value, are really difficult to measure. It's hard to get the data. You have to get it from external suppliers, vendors, stakeholders. And frankly, companies can't maintain the same level of rigor or internal controls as they could as if it was their own data. And so by including the scope 3 emissions requirement, but excluding penalties or phasing them in over a longer period of time for scope 3 misstatements, companies are essentially encouraged to act and disclose now, get their house in order without fear of legal or financial recourse for noncompliance while they work to get it right, because it does take a little bit of time to really wrap your arms around that whole process. So now let's talk about California's next law, SB 261, the Climate Related Financial Risk Act. And that is requiring companies to prepare annual climate related financial risk disclosures, essentially aligned with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure, now, of course, enveloped into the ISSB IFRS standards. And so that applies to companies with annual revenues exceeding 500 million. So it applies to more companies than SB 253, but again, those that do business within the state of California. Reporting for that law starts in 2026, and penalties for violations can reach up to $50,000. So there's some real money on the table for noncompliance with these laws. Now, one that we haven't spoken about as much on this podcast is AB 1305, or the Voluntary Carbon Market Disclosures Act. And this focuses disclosure requirements for companies that are making net zero or carbon neutrality claims, as well as those that are involved in the voluntary carbon markets. So this is essentially requiring public disclosure of carbon offset projects, including verification measures and the data and actual calculation methods of how that project was verified. This is meant to bring accountability and transparency into the offsetting project and neutrality claims. And it frankly brings a lot of rigor and standardization to the voluntary carbon markets, which are widely considered controversial, very difficult to measure and ensure the intended impact or stated impact of those projects. And that law also has pretty hefty penalties. Civil penalties up to $500,000 can be imposed for noncompliance. And so California is really leading the way again, as it often does, but we are seeing movement in other states. Both Washington state as well as New York have similarly proposed laws, corporate climate accountability acts, which very similar to SB 253 will require large corporate entities to disclose emissions across scopes 1, 2, and yes, scope 3, again, with a phased timeline for insurance. And now it's really interesting to note that many of these disclosure laws actually prescribe in the legislation compliance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate accounting and reporting standard and the Scope 3 corporate value chain standard. And they themselves are Greenhouse Gas Protocol is actually reviewing those standards right now with a lot of technical working groups. Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as we all know, it's the gold standard of carbon accounting, but it was written a while ago and it was created for voluntary disclosure. And now that it's being applied and prescribed in laws for regulated and mandated disclosure, there's a lockstep effort by the GHGP to modernize the standards to make sure that they are reflective of how they're currently being applied throughout this global landscape. So I mentioned this because in choosing a carbon management partner, whether it's a SaaS provider, whether it's a service provider, whatever works best for your company, it is essential to select one that is GHGP aligned and is following all of the methodologies laid out in that standard, because that is what is required for all of this mandated disclosure. Now, we do love these laws. We love these laws, right? They are critical to drive decarbonization. They encourage accountability and transparency. And they frankly convey critical information to financial markets and to capital markets on really material risks and opportunities. The laws, however, are not without their challenges. And so while some remain to be signed into law, some of them, like in the state of California, have actually been signed in, and they're frankly sure to face some backlash. So, if you remember, we spoke about on this podcast back in 2022, the Supreme Court's ruling against the EPA, where the conservative majority in the Supreme Court voted to limit the agency's powers to regulate emissions from power plants under the Clean Air Act. And what we saw is, and what we're seeing today is similar tactics. Conservative legislators are likely going to try to file suit against government agencies for trying to regulate emissions. So we shouldn't be surprised to see those kind of similar tactics at the state level ambitions. And there is, in fact, already a lawsuit underway that was brought by a coalition of business groups, including the state chambers of commerce in California. I think what we're seeing in most cases, frankly, is that corporate actors know the writing is on the wall. Disclosure mandates are coming. Leaders in the space have already been disclosing for years. The mass market is really readying. They are getting their house in order. It's really only the laggards that are kind of waiting to see where these laws shake out. But what we continue to see with the companies we talk to is huge increase in corporate inventories, expanding into those Scope 3 emissions. We see a lot of pre-audit readiness checks getting ready for that third-party assurance requirement. So don't let the politics fool you. A lot of these lawsuits, and I'm sure, there probably will be more. They're expected. This is part of the game. These laws weren't passed expecting anything else. So don't let it deter you, any of those on the line. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you next week for another week in sustainability.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.